I think we all crave this idea that there's a binary or like a linear relationship. In some ways, we think of regeneration as it's regenerative or it's degenerative, right? So the extractive capability of farming, right, where we deplete the soil or deplete the land, even by any percentage point, and then fast forward 100 years, there's degeneration. The carrying capacity of that land diminishes. Like any kind of farming is all about resource extraction at some point. But what I've come to discover about regenerative agriculture is that first and foremost, it's a mindset.
That was a sneak preview from our guest, Mike Woronuk, on today's episode about regenerative farming and what it means to be on the journey to a regenerative farm. I've known Mike for a number of years now, and it's always great to have a conversation that's a little bit more personal. I always find my conversations with Mike so insightful and inspiring, and he's just somebody who articulates his thoughts super well in such a clear and concise way, and I always find it very insightful. Mike has a really interesting background. He grew up on a farm, then moved to New York City, now still lives in New York City, but works for a regenerative farm down in North Carolina called Juneberry Ridge. And Juneberry Ridge is a really special place. I was actually able to visit it. It's a beautiful farm with lots of farm animals and lots of adoption of regenerative practices. We're going to talk about their journey to creating a more sustainable food system on their farm at Juneberry Ridge. So really hope you enjoyed today's episode. Everyone, welcome to the Made to Sustain podcast. I'm your host, Kelly DeVico, and I'm thrilled and super excited to introduce to you today Mike Woronuk from Juneberry Ridge. Hey, Mike.
Hi, Kelly. It's good to be here on Made to Sustain.
Super happy to have you. I like to ask my guests when they first come on, what is the most interesting food you've eaten lately?
I was just in Atlanta, Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And outside a building called the Candida Building for Sustainable Innovation, there were Juneberries. And I pulled the Juneberries right off the plant, and they were perfectly ripe and perfectly sweet. And they are interesting, but they aren't new to me. They're my favorite berry in the whole world. I didn't know you were going to ask that, and I didn't plan to tell you that. So I promise that wasn't an intended plug.
That's awesome. It's always nice when you're able to find something that's a little close to home in an unfamiliar location.
Absolutely. I have to say I was really surprised because it's May and my uncles in Canada sometimes call me to ask how the July berry project is going. Because in Canada, these berries are called Saskatoons. Called Juneberries because often they fruit in June in the northeast of the United States. But now that I've traveled all the way to Atlanta, Georgia, and seen them fruiting in May, I kind of think maybe we should call them Mayberries in Georgia, Juneberries in the Northeast, and July berries in the true North.
I love that. That's fun. Are you worried about climate change affecting the Juneberry?
That's a good question. I think we should be worried about climate changing affecting all of our landscapes. Of course, we're seeing the warming of our grow regions, and where Juneberries are really happy and thriving, they like many of the apple family of fruits, also crave a little bit of cold in their grow season. So I think the changing and warming of our climates has a big impact on agriculture as a whole.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think I was just speaking with another guest on our show, Joni, and she was telling me about her experience out in Idaho. We talked a little bit about the regenerative landscape too. Now that we have the opportunity to plant new crops, how can we plant them in a new way that gives back to the earth?
Right. Well, I think one of the things that it does make me think about, because we get into the world of climate change and it gets doom and gloom pretty quickly, right? However, when we look out to nature is always in motion. Nature's always been changing. The average temperature or average rainfall that any region gets naturally changes over time. I think what's true for agriculture, being the oldest profession in human history, change is part of the game. And it's really how we adapt to that and the kind of new solutions and new ways we find to both improve our system, but also work with nature to find the new future for farming.
Yeah, I love that. And maybe you can tell us about your experience with farming and how it's near and dear to your heart.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel so grateful all the time that I get to be a Canadian living in New York, working for a farm in North Carolina. It's a very unique constellation of details, but I've always felt farm adjacent, always kind of one foot in farming and one foot in city and urban life, you know. So my dad grew up on our family farm in northern Alberta. I grew up in a city called Calgary, which is in the southern part of Alberta, and our farm is about 7 hours north of there. So I
Wow.
spent my youth and my summers kind of driving up on long drives to get to the farm. But then you go out and explore the world. And I pursued marketing as a career. And that took me to a lot of different places for a long time, very far away from the farm. And the thing about working at Juneberry Ridge in North Carolina today is that I get to combine this kind of career of marketing and communications and business development that I've done over the past few decades and bring it back to my roots, but also a very different, side of farming. My family has farmed for 100 years, where my great grandparents homesteaded from Ukraine in 1912. And my great grandparents, my grandparents, my dad's brothers, still farm that land. And now my cousin is farming that land. So they bring to my life the kind of history and love for farming that you could only have as part of a farming family. And yet there's all this new territory to explore, new things to learn about from what they do in terms of conventional farming or row cropping. They do grains, barley, wheat, canola. And at Juneberry Ridge, we have quite a different system. And what we've been pursuing is regenerative agriculture.
I agree. I don't think enough people everywhere appreciate how their food gets from the farm to the grocery store. It could be direct produce, it could be farm to manufacturer to another manufacturer to the retail space. It's so very incredibly complex. One other thing, I just had a very interesting conversation about how your skill sets, whether you like it or not, transfer over and always show up in new stages of life. It's funny, the ones that you think you'll never need are the ones you end up needing the most.
Absolutely. No, I definitely see that. I think you kind of dig in deeper where you tend to be learning the most. And I think that for me has probably been the most surprising factor. Like you mentioned, just consumers at large, which we all are consumers, right? And we
Mhm.
go to the grocery store, we maybe are fortunate enough to go to a farmer's market. Of course, we all have relation with food, but the more you look into where we are with food and agriculture today, the more I find there's more to learn and more to read. I've been buying books and they just kind of keep stacking up. I'm definitely buying books about farming and regeneration at a faster rate than I'm reading. So it keeps me interested and kind of excited for what's in store for the future.
Absolutely. I mean, as somebody who's worked in the food industry for about 10 years, I'm amazed with how much there is to learn still. I don't feel like I've even scratched the surface of all there is because you have, the agriculture side, you have the manufacturing side, the CPG side, food service, everything. There's so much to learn and so much improvements to make too. The way that we've always done things isn't the way that necessarily we should be continuing to do them moving forward either.
Hmm. And I always love, working with you, Kelly, because we've had the opportunity to work on a few projects in our careers. And I always feel like you're the food expert, the food scientist on the
Mhm.
call. And I'm always hungry to learn about the mechanics of, the food ingredients that we were working on. And yet, there's always the danger at looking at somebody across the table and thinking, that's where all the answers are, when really we're all on a process of learning and understanding the world together. So the world of food and agriculture is really exciting to be a part of.
Yeah, I agree. It is fun to know a lot about food, but it is also not fun to know a lot about where your food comes from too. The more you learn, the less you wish you knew sometimes.
Unless you discover a regenerative farming destination in North Carolina.
There it is.
So
Tell me more about that, Mike.
yeah, so over the past 4 years now, I've had the pleasure of leading marketing for a farm called Juneberry Ridge, located in Norwood, North Carolina, which is right in the center of the state, which happens to also be in the center of the Piedmont region, which spans from New York all the way down to southwest in Alabama. And it's this kind of strip of really fertile plains and rolling hills on the foot of the Appalachian Mountain Range. And so Juneberry Ridge is located about an hour east of Charlotte, and it's 750 acres, rolling hills, pastures, and really abundant forests. One of the things I like to say, even just internally as our team, is like we have a big role to educate just even what our farm looks like. Because most people, you say farm and you close your eyes, and you might not picture this rolling hills and forested landscape with, ducks and chickens and sheep and pigs and guardian geese and guinea fowl and turkeys all kind of cohabitating in a diverse set of pastures and wildlife. Juneberry Ridge is certainly a farm first, and we've been pursuing regenerative agriculture pretty significantly. I think the idea really took root in 2019, but then right before the pandemic, we embarked much more seriously into establishing and kind of shifting some of the procedures on the farm to really embody our regenerative mission, which means growing any kind of produce or food without pesticides, without chemicals, without synthetic fertilizers in the system, and then also inviting people to come learn about that. Even before Regeneration, we were building greenhouses, and we were really excited about the potential for aquaponics to transform our food system, to give us all season food, but that also we could grow fish in harmony with plants, and the nitrogen cycling and that would happen from between fish and plant and the water, so growing without soil, had a potential to improve our fisheries, prevent us from overfishing our rivers and oceans, while also growing all season produce. But what we quickly found is that it is an input based business, right? So as much as aquaponics is a closed loop system, there are certain kind of chemicals and energy that needs to go into that system that make it a little less sustainable than we'd first imagined. So we're working on transitioning our greenhouses to be more aligned with our regenerative mission. But over the past 4 years, we've grown our animal and livestock programs. So we have about 3,000 animals on site. As a destination, we do education. We've got a conference center. We've got 7 cabins, and we're inviting people to come and explore and learn more about local food systems, and also just the idea of regeneration and all the ways that that can impact you as you connect with healthy food and healthy landscape.
I want to go back to a phrase you mentioned about being on the journey to regenerative. What does that mean? Because for some people, there's no gray area. It's either regenerative or it's not. But what does it mean to be on the journey of regenerative? And what does that mean for Juneberry Ridge?
Yeah, I think our entire team wrestles with this question and has been doing so for years, right? I think we all crave this idea that there's a binary or like a linear relationship. In some ways, we think of regeneration as it's regenerative or it's degenerative, right? So the extractive capability of farming, right? Where we deplete the soil or deplete the land, even by any percentage point, and then fast forward 100 years, there's degeneration. The carrying capacity of that land diminishes. Like any kind of farming is all about resource extraction at some point. But what I've come to discover about regenerative agriculture is that first and foremost, it's a mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And the more you learn about that mindset, just like any philosophy or way of understanding the world, you start to learn it's relational, and it has so many applications to life beyond that subject you might have first started researching. Regenerative agriculture can mean a lot of different people in their different contexts. for whether you're a large commercial farming corporation or a small kind of privately owned, small 750 acre farm like ourselves. It's the context in which you apply it that matters most. Regenerative is really about understanding that we live and interact in systems around us. So everything we do has some kind of knock-on effect or impact on some other system. And if we think of ourselves as being good ancestors, right, 7 generations from now, are we putting more equity into our land, into our farming, and even our people in our community? Are we actually contributing more than we're extracting? And so the more you try to pursue that, the more regenerative you are in your practice. But we say we're in the process of that. And I think we probably always will be because, I debate this with my colleagues and our head of operations. Do we aim for perfection or do we aim for progress? And as long as we're making progress, I think we're part of the solution.
Yeah, I love that. Talk to me about the different kinds of animals and crops that you're growing on Juneberry, and how did you get from having crops to now all of these animals on the farm, and how does that play a role in regeneration?
It all started, honestly, with plants and fish, right? And the question was asked to our founder, Judy Carpenter, what kind of animals would you be comfortable with having on premise? She said, well, fish, right? It's kind of easy. And that's how we got into aquaponics. But as we, again, started to research and read, the more you think about, the system of systems that we operate in, the more you need animals to participate in that system, right? So if we're trying to transition as part of our landscape, so we talked about the Piedmont Plateau. Piedmont means, it's an Italian word for at the foot of the mountains. And this whole region's at the foot of the mountains, which means there's lots of rolling hills and forests. It has happened to be a good place to establish monoculture pine forests. Inside our 750 acres, there's quite a large segment of that historically, before the property became under the ownership of Judy Carpenter, were arbor farms. Now, the thing, if you're growing a pine forest of, that's full of pine needles, there's only one type of tree in there. There's not actually a lot of life. So if we're going to rehabilitate that land, we first need to cull those trees, but then we have 2 options to invest back in that soil. One, load it full of fertilizers and take the conventional approach, or load it full of animals. One of the first reasons we have so many animals is that our pigs and our sheep particularly are part of our workforce. Our chickens too. They're roaming and tracking through these lands in such a way that they're getting nourishment from the forest and really diverse diet, also an active diet. So there's no kind of, pens that they're cooped up in, and rather we do rotational grazing under, intensively grazed small areas over time. And then by doing so, taking away those pine forests and getting the animals in there, then we're also encouraging biodiversity to come back up through the land. You asked about the other things we grow. Well, the meat from those products is part of our farm produce as well. So certainly, make use of the eggs and the chicken and the pork and the lamb inside of our hospitality services. So we have a kitchen on site, and we run catering for, a few small weddings a year. We also host a lot of private events and music festival every summer. So we get to connect the regeneration of the land to also, more nutrient dense and more healthful food for our customers. So a lot of different things going on. It's hard to kind of pick just, one to talk about.
Which one's your favorite to talk about?
I'm always just kind of finding something new at the farm. This year, it's really the 3rd year we've had sheep, more meaningfully the 2nd year. And so we had a flock of about 300 sheep on site. And this year we had our lambing season, which happens every spring. And it was the first time that we put together a program where we invited guests to come out and feed a lamb. We had about 100 plus baby lambs on site, and we're able to bring people to kind of experience the farm in a new way. I'm just always excited to learn what's new about that. And one of the surprising things for me is that an experience like lamb feeding sounds like this would be like a petting zoo or there'd be a lot of kids involved. And we do serve kids, I mean, they come by with their parents, fairly regularly. But I'd say more than 80% of the customers for these lamb feeding experiences are actually adults and couples and, even retirees, people looking for, reasons to get out of the city or reasons to get out of their urban environment and into nature. The thing that always excites me is learning something about the farm and then finding ways to connect that with people who want more connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
To food, to the food they eat, to the landscape. And the more we can do that, it's actually quite hard work to find purpose between those two things, right? There's a lot of reasons to visit a farm, but in many ways, it just always feels like we're discovering new about our customers, the communities we serve, and how to connect farm so that it's relevant to everyday life.
I'm a little surprised that you said 80% of that demographic is adults, because I remember visiting our local farms with my grandparents when we would take a bag of carrots and we'd go and we'd feed the goats and we'd feed the sheep. And even when I was in college, we had a farm. I was in the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, but it was affectionately known as the Ag School. And I would always go and feed the cows and feed the goats, and they were always so much fun. I don't know whether I appreciated it more as a kid or as an adult, but if you haven't done it before, it's definitely a rewarding and interesting experience like none other.
Yeah, we all probably have similar experiences in our life. And I should mention, I mean, we do serve a lot of students, and we have an educational nonprofit that does, more formal programs with K-12 students as well as high schools and colleges. We do paid internships or working experiences for a couple weeks to 16 weeks on our farm. But it's really this like sense of a place to go and a place to discover. We're positioned to serve an adult population, right? That maybe hasn't has as much connection even as you did going to this biosciences / agriculture school. When you're in that environment, it seems obvious, right? That people should easily find connection to the farm. But there's a lot of not just inner city schools, but schools around America and towns large and small that just don't have that opportunity. The more you research about this, it's like the turn of the century when urbanism and people really grew into the cities, people still had a family connection. Like we talked about my connection to the farm. I'm an outlier these days. Not most people have one generation back and can look at their cousin or their uncle and say, I want to come visit the farm. That used to be more ubiquitous, right? About 100 years ago in the early 1900s, most people had one or two kind of generations or a cousin connection to be able to go out and visit the land and connect with the land and see where food was made. Today, we don't have that as a society. And I think more people are craving it, maybe even after the pandemic where our relation to the world changed. And I'm seeing it all the time that when people come to visit and they see the forest or spend time in the forest, they want to be at the farm more. They want to come back again and say that they actually want more time in the forest, not less time in the forest.
What's one thing or one group of people that have surprised you the most about their experience on the farm?
Wow. I started this year creating an all-inclusive experience where, because we've got a chef and kitchen team, we're growing the food, we've got the accommodations, and we've got the knowledge to kind of teach people things about food. And so we have all these component parts, but this year was the first time we launched something that we're calling it the farm stay weekends, right? So there's a regenerative farm stay and you arrive on a Friday and leave on a Sunday after brunch. And so we kind of wine you and dine you and teach you a little bit about how we're growing, in our greenhouses and our landscape. What's really surprising is how many people are coming to these experiences. And they're pretty intimate, right? So we've got 5 one-bed cabins and 2 3-bed cabins. So the groups of people, something like 10 to 15 people at these experiences. What's surprising is that people are coming to connect with each other and from all walks of life. Generational gaps, urban and rural gaps, socio-political gaps. And to be able to kind of sit around a table and break bread together has this really unifying effect that is almost like the magic sauce that it's hard to predict, and yet people want it. People want to connect with others. Just imagine you go to a restaurant, no matter what price that restaurant is. Are you ever expected to sit next to somebody and talk to them? I mean, it really rarely happens. And yet, if you go to a farm experience, if you go to agritourism, you kind of expect to sit around a farm table and have a chat with the people working that farm, and in a place like ours, other people that are there for the same reasons as you. And I think that's been really one of the more special things to see in action.
It sounds like when people come to Juneberry, even if they go home, right? Well, I'm sure they go home. It's not Hotel California. Um, I'm sure they feel like they've built a community that can stay with them. I find that sometimes I go on vacation only to find that the person that I've met lives like 2 or 3 towns over from me. So I hope that some people get the same experience at Juneberry too, so they can continue to form those relationships and continue the appreciation for the farm and all that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a couple other examples of people there, a mother-daughter, working kind of professional daughter that, her husband wasn't available. And she said, "Mom, why don't you come with me?" And her mom's retired, and they came and just had the most wonderful time. And they were like, "We wouldn't change a thing. This was the most amazing way to connect with each other as a mother-daughter duo." And then the fact that we're all there experiencing things together was really special. And I think experience has the opportunity to do that. People don't want things. I think we all probably feel like we have enough things, right? But it's connection that, in a world of screens and impersonal experiences that are kind of conventional, right? Restaurants, as I gave that example, they lead us to not necessarily be as connected as we could be. So it makes what we're doing exciting, and people are what make life also really interesting, right? We can only learn from each other in the same way that we try to let nature lead us in our farming methods. People lead us to new connections as well. So agritourism is a fun industry to work in.
Aside from the farm tour, which I'm sure is incredible, what kinds of other activities can people expect if they come on a weekend to Juneberry?
We've integrated all sorts of things from wellness and movement into farming process, the food experience, maybe even some more meditative wellness or mindfulness, right? So we have a yoga practitioner that starts the experience with what's called a yoga nidra, which I've done yoga for many years, and I've never done a yoga nidra. So I'm learning again what that means, which is basically yoga sleep, and you sit or lay down perfectly comfortable with some sound bath crystal bowls rolling at the same time. And I've just never felt so well rested. So we do that on a Friday night, a really restful, intention setting yoga practice. And in the spring and fall, so we're not going to do it in the hottest months of summer, but starting back in September, October, and November, we're doing forest bathing again. So forest bathing is 3 hours in the forest, which again sounded like way too much time to me the first time I looked at it. And yet, I did it in March, and again, I'm raving about it. I'm like, more time in the forest. I've always gone from A to B, or hike a trail, or go to a waterfall or something like that. You never just set the forest as your destination.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's something about just kind of going into the forest and taking notice that is really grounding and very stress relieving, actually. So we do those experiences, and we came up with an integrated kind of tour called our Garden to Glass mixology class, where we do an hour in our aquaponics greenhouse, show you how we grow things in our system, then harvest some of those things. So we'll grow like 8 different types of basils, or different types of mints, or actually there's a multitude of tomatoes that we might grow, and then harvest those and bring them into our Toad House event venue and muddle them and stir them and mix them with different infusions, and learn how to honor those flavors and make cocktails or mocktails depending on your preference, and integrate a lunch experience around that. So we're really looking at all these different ways to have really full experiences that are connected to food and taste and growing, and not just kind of serving the traditional service method is you show up and you order your cocktail and somebody else makes it for you. But what if you actually went and harvested and learned how that plant grew and the history of that plant, and then also muddle it yourself? It kind of all just tastes that much better if you can get that kind of closeness to your food.
It's a totally different experience, that's for sure.
Yeah, and it's a lot of fun. So we're always coming up with new ways to develop new experiences. This summer, we're launching our Explore Tour, which is more about our edible landscapes. So looking out into the forest and also the designed landscape. So I say design landscape in terms of things we've intentionally planted, like blackberries or wild strawberries, stuff like that. But just taking more of a notice into what is edible for humans in the landscape, but also what serves the ecology, right? So we're walking our guests through our edible landscapes and our greenhouses, and then having kind of an elevated picnic, maybe by the stream or out on the side of the hill next to our pond. We're always looking for different ways to follow the seasons with our experiences. And that kind of leads us to talk about what we're growing seasonally as well.
What are you guys growing this summer?
Well, this is really our biggest year yet in continuing to expand and grow our animal population. So I think we're really still just figuring out all the best ways to do that. We've got about 200 pigs, about 300 sheep. Maybe there's quite a few more sheep, actually, if you count all the lambs that we've just brought into the world. We're trying a few different heritage breeds of turkeys that we'll be preparing for the turkey harvest in November. And we are also just in the midst of thinking through the different things that we would be growing in our greenhouse. We spent the last few years growing a lot of lettuces, basils, cut chives, arugula, and we're starting to kind of investigate what are some more native landscaping plantings that we develop horticulturally and then also kind of develop for our landscape and develop for others. What we've actually found is when we are doing some of that designed landscape, it's hard to find really good sources of really suited species to plant even in our own landscape. So we're kind of looking across North Carolina to find the best sources of that. We're just starting to get ahead of what that means in our own growing facilities and how we can be able to address that gap.
So do you grow crops outdoors, or are the crops only grown in greenhouses with aquaponic systems?
Yeah, we do. I should mention we have a small but growing market garden. So a majority of the food that we grow serves our kitchen and our on-site guest hospitality. We do a little bit of farmers markets and a little bit of donating food to food banks and local community centers as well. We're kind of working on how this system comes together. When you talk about regenerative farming, it's, at least for us, it's easier to connect the dots between animal and soil and wild ecology. So we get that protein, coming out of the animal production. When you talk about market gardens, there's no animal impact on that soil, right? So there's a bit of a different process in how we do that. So we kind of have a mixed system. You ask the question, how are we in the process of pursuing a regeneration? In what ways does our market garden, which is outside in the soil, interact and coalesce with our indoor greenhouses, all season growing? And how does that coalesce with the rehabilitation of our forests and those areas that were formerly monoculture pines, and we've culled those to build a better system for our silvopasture? The short answer is we grow a little bit of everything and we're kind of figuring it out.
I think more people need that mindset. You got to figure out what's working before you can really double down and become experts.
And it takes time, right? It takes iteration. Everything I read, again, these books I keep piling up, but reading a bit more about gardening, I mean, the first thing people will say is that it takes a lot of experimentation. And this is the difference between conventional farming today. And it's really important for us, at least at Juneberry Ridge, to say conventional farming is incredibly important, right? It's literally feeding the world today. But as we look at being part of the solution for tomorrow, you need some change agents. You need smaller groups of farmers coming together to talk about different processes, to talk about how if we grew for nutrient density, or if we grew for a diverse system on our landscape, then we might need to change our systems a little bit. But if there was a rule book or a list of things we could check off, it certainly would be a lot easier, probably be a lot less interesting. And uh, it really just requires us to be really curious and resilient in our own failures too, right? Learning what worked and what didn't work and how to keep adjusting. I think we talked a lot about agritourism and this idea of being an education center, a beacon for education. Well, if we're not learning anything, we're not going to have much of interest to say to other people. And so I think it kind of is in its own way, its own kind of self-fulfilling virtuous circle where we learn a lot in our experimentation, and then we get to fuel that into our guest experience, and then they get to learn things and challenge us and ask us interesting questions, and we put it back in and keeps going around in a circle, which keeps Juneberry Ridge always fresh and always new.
That's great. What's one of the most interesting topics you found in the Education Center?
Well, I think because my family, we grew up without a lot of animals on our farm, right? It's several thousand acres of row crop, barley, canola, stuff like that. So if we had chickens or cows, we had like 2 cows, just to feed the family harvest, or a small group of chickens in a chicken coop, pretty standard farm stuff. You say chickens and I can immediately smell the chicken coop. Like I know exactly what that smells like. Spoiler alert, it's not that appealing. Yet, what I found really surprising in talking with Adam, our livestock manager, about our chicken program is chickens don't really smell like that naturally. They smell like that because we put them in a small little box and then tell them to call that home. Chickens in nature do a lot more roaming.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have really healthy chickens, if you're raising them for health and nutrient density, you're going to be moving them along in your paddocks pretty regularly. So they're getting new diets and eating on different grasses and insects and things pretty naturally. But also the landscape never really smells like a chicken coop. And so that was kind of, I don't know, news to me. I've only ever thought of or even visited larger farms that have huge chicken production capabilities with our kind of 1,000+ birds throughout the year. If they're co-located for a while, you start to smell a little bit of that. The typical idea of a farm, we go back to that idea. If you close your eyes and you picture a chicken coop and all the things that come with that. And if you look at a regenerative farm, you typically see the farmers with the mobile chicken coop that rolls across the paddocks. And the chickens are happier, the landscape is happier. That typical farm smell is a lot different compared to what many of us have experienced if you drive by a feedlot or some of the conventional farming production. There are things like that are just, really novel and interesting to learn. I'm sure if we ask our young students that come through, each of them will say something unique and interesting about regenerative agriculture and farming at large.
Yeah, that's great. We're coming up on time here, so I've just got a couple more questions for you.
Sure.
How has your perspective on regenerative farming changed since you started at Juneberry and maybe 1 year ago from Juneberry?
When I started at Juneberry, I have to say I knew absolutely nothing about regenerative farming. It was a completely new concept. The best thing I did was I watched a film that is now available on Disney Plus called The Biggest Little Farm. And you watch this kind of landscape blossom in California, a place called Apricot Lane Farms. So you start to think, hey, this is really fun and exciting and possible. The more I've contemplated this idea of what is regenerative farming, the more I learn about new systems. And the more I learn that there's an infinite amount of systems to learn about. So we talked a lot about animals and our guest experience and even the soil. The thing that we also are doing, growing grasslands to full maturity. And it sounds kind of like if you would have talked to me about grass 4 years ago, I probably would have been really bored. But now I'm so curious, about the full life cycle of grass and allowing a grassland after it's been intensively grazed to come back up to full seed. Typically, even farmers will go in and cut that grass off and keep it well mowed. So I'm just really aware of the power of grasslands to sequester carbon, to capture the carbon in from the world. And we think of, the carbon capture power of forests and we think about Brazil and the rainforest, and we kind of discredit the power of our grasslands and our own plains. So that's been a new thing for me to contemplate. And a lot of farmers talk about cover cropping and how that relates to also letting different grasses and plants go into full maturity between growing productive crops. And so those are some of the things I'm curious about these days, and just generally the topic of diversity in farming and those systems that we interrelate with.
I love that. What's one thing you wish more people understood about food sustainability or regenerative farming?
One thing I wish that people could just have a better awareness for is that, I mean, we're all consumers and we've got to go to the grocery store and we've got to buy the foods, right? And we're all going in there to try. I don't know if you feel this way, but I go in there and I try to do the right thing. I'm like, I want to, both
Absolutely.
for our own health, right? We want to choose the more healthy stuff. And I think we try to pay a premium for that. And we try to pay for things that have ethical sourcing and all the rest of it. And I wish people would just go in there and realize that just because it says organic on it doesn't really mean it's worth, 30% more. It means that someone's gone through a process of marketing that product with organic on the label. And if you really want to be part of the solution to our food challenges, the best thing you can do is say, where are my local farmers? Where are they selling their foods? And perhaps which of them are inviting people on site to experience their farm? Because if you could actually know the farmer at the farmers markets, or even better, on their farm, if they have lodging or experiences, you might put more stock and more value into local food systems. And that's worth a lot more than a food label, especially on a product sold at a grocery store.
I love that, and I agree 100%. One of the things I look forward to every week is going to my farmer's market right down the street. There's really no better feeling than to just go and buy my produce, whether it's from the organic farm stand or, the conventional farm stand, just meeting the farmers that grow my food. And they're just the greatest source of knowledge. Like, hey, what do I do with the tops of my beets? They've got all these beet tops, and normally when I go to the grocery store, they're small little things that have already been peeled. And what do I do with them? And there's so many bits and insights that you can get from just talking to the person that's grown the food. They know it the best. So I 100% agree.
So you asked me what I ate that was interesting. And I said Saskatoons / Juneberries. And now you said beets, and that happens to be my favorite vegetable.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's an amazing vegetable.
They're underrated.
Totally underrated. Cooking with the beet greens is something my family does. And
Oh, yeah?
as a kid, I used to really not be happy to eat borscht or like this beet soup or anything with the beet leaves wrapped around them. But these days I get so excited to find the fresh beets and then find different ways to cook and use that as a vegetable. So we've come full circle, Kelly.
We sure have. Any last thoughts on the show today that we didn't cover?
No, I just say thank you for having me, and I'm excited to have been following you on the Made to Sustain blog, and excited to keep the conversation going. I'm always learning a lot, and I'm sure if we talk a few months or a year from now, there'll be a whole new world of perspective and insights we could talk more about.
Absolutely. That sounds great. Thanks so much for coming on the show today, Mike. And if you haven't already, check out Juneberry Ridge and see if they have any openings for later this summer. Thanks so much. And that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, having recorded it. Like I said, it's always a really interesting conversation to have when you're learning about somebody's background and how it affects where they are today. My 3 biggest takeaways from this episode are: don't be afraid to reach out and find new and better ways of doing things. I think that's always really important. The second takeaway from this episode is don't be afraid to make changes, just because the way that you were doing things in the past isn't going to get you to where you're going to be in the future. The last thing that I learned is that it really takes a village, right? So I really love what Juneberry is doing with inviting people into the community and holding the jam festivals and inviting people onto their farm. I think it's really captivating the amount of transparency that goes into their farming practices and their growing practices, which really does make it a really unique and special place. If you want to learn more about Juneberry, check out juneberry.com. It's a really fantastic place, and if you do get the opportunity to ever go visit their farm down in Norwood, North Carolina, I highly recommend you doing so. I had a great time myself. Thanks for listening to today's episode, and don't forget to come back next week where we're going to speak with Josh over at Wise Bar, which is going to be focused on the topic around mindful eating and a mindful diet. So I think it's a super interesting topic, but really trendy right now. So I think it'll be a really interesting conversation to have. And don't forget to leave us a rating. Really definitely helps. And don't forget to subscribe so you stay tuned and stay plugged in for all of the upcoming episodes. Don't forget to check out madetosustain.com, where we'll have the episode show notes and the transcripts in case you missed anything, and all of the other links as well. So really looking forward to having you guys come along on the journey to learn more about sustainable food and making it more simple. Thanks. Bye.